talk, which is kind of what is AI, presume that here's kind of a baseline understanding. My experience the last decade or so applying complex machine learning techniques in financial services. And I have two more stories. So I'm sure it's obvious to all of you, machine learning is being used and AI is being used in all kinds of highly regulated industries these days. It's being used to make all sorts of high-stakes decisions about people's lives. Whether you get a job, whether you get a kidney transplant, whether you get a loan, those decisions are all increasingly made by AI systems. And our specialty at Fair Play is helping financial institutions apply complex machine learning techniques to the problem of credit underwriting specifically. And just a little bit of history on credit underwriting. So it used to be that once upon a time, lending decisions were made by humans who tried to assess an applicant's creditworthiness. They were almost always made by dudes in ties. And you know, in the 70s and 80s, we started using mathematics instead of humans because it was seemingly more neutral and objective. And so, for example, you can see here a decision tree. You can start with a person's credit history. Is it good or bad? You move to the next fork in the tree. Is their income high or low? You move to the next fork in the tree. Are they seeking a large loan amount or a small loan amount? And depending on your answers to all those questions, you get to some reasonable answer. The problem with this is that it assumes that all these variables, credit history, income, loan amount, etc., it assumes that all of these relationships are linear, that they're straightforward, right? And so if you wanted to, but you can see there's all kinds of problems with assuming linearity, right? So imagine you were trying to classify good borrowers from bad borrowers, and the bad borrowers were represented by red dots, and the good borrowers were represented by green dots. If your system for classifying who's a good borrower and a bad borrower is linear, right? It's kind of brittle. You're going to see that you're going to end up with some blue dots on the decline side of the line, and you're going to end up with some red dots on the approved side of the line. And so, of course, the problem with linearity is that the world is not linear, right? The world is nuanced. And if you need some example of this, let me give you one. So imagine we were trying to build an AI system to predict the sex of an individual. This is a terrible idea. Do not do this. I'm only saying this to make me. Okay? Imagine that we were trying to predict the sex of an individual, and what if I said to you as an input to that model, I am going to give you a person's height. Well, height is somewhat predictive of sex, right? Because men tend to be taller than women. Of course, there are some really tall women in the world, and there are some really short men in the world. So the problem with using height is that it's going to be somewhat inaccurate. So what if I said, okay, well, in addition to height, I'm going to give you weight. Well, weight actually adds incremental predictive power because even at the same height, men tend to be heavier than women due to things like testosterone and bone muscle density. The problem with a model that seeks to predict sex on the basis of height and weight, though, is that it's going to classify every child as a woman. So what if I told you, okay, well, in addition to height and weight, I'm going to give you birth date to control for the fact that there are children in the world. Well, now our system of predicting sex is actually doing pretty good. But if I had told you a moment ago that birth date was predictive of sex, you would have told me I was crazy. And that is an illustration of this point of nonlinearity, right? These seemingly unrelated variables that when they interact with other variables actually encode information. So about a decade ago, my co-founder, who's a bona fide AI pioneer, PhD in pure mathematics at Wisconsin, not Caltech, but Wisconsin, pretty. He spent several years at Google and several years before that. We set out to apply complex machine learning techniques to credit underwriting. And we faced a cold start problem, which is we didn't have any data. This was kind of in the wake of the great financial crisis. crisis, and so we went out and we bought a data set from a failed lender. And we trained up our first machine learning model, and we were extremely proud of ourselves. What was the model's recommendation? You should go make loans in Arkansas. Now, it just so happens that my co-founder, John, is from Arkansas. And he happens to know that the legal regime in Arkansas is extremely hostile to the kinds of loans that we were proposing to make. So then we start digging into it. We're like, why does the model think we should make loans in Arkansas? Well, it turns out that the data set we bought didn't have any loans from Arkansas. And that meant, and that meant that the data set did not include any defaulted loans from Arkansas, from which the model concluded that loans never went bad in Arkansas, right? So you can see how, this famous phrase, garbage in, garbage out, it's especially true of these machine learning systems. So now you have another problem, right? That was a missing data problem, but you also have the problem of lots of data, which leads to a phenomenon called combinatorial explosion, right? And you can sort of see this combinatorial explosion problem in the how do we predict, birthday is predictive of sex example that I gave you a few minutes ago. And the problem with having so many variables is that understanding the algorithm that connects those variables to the outcome is so complex that no human could understand it. And that's what's sometimes referred to in AI as the black box problem. You know that the robot did a thing, but you don't necessarily know why the robot did the thing. And if you think about it for a second, there's all kinds of reasons to be wary of using a black box when making a high-stakes decision about someone's life. Let me give you one example. So we work with a subprime auto lender in the western United States. They serve a bunch of states in the western United States. It's a used car lender. And they had two variables in their model. The first variable of the model was, what is the mileage on the car that is proposed to be purchased? And if you think about it, that variable has a very intuitive relationship to creditworthiness, right? The higher the mileage of the car, the more likely it is to break down. The more likely it is to break down, the more likely the borrower is to miss work. The more likely you are to miss work, the more likely you are to miss a payment on your auto loan, right? What is the mileage of the car? Totally reasonable variable on which to make a credit decision for an auto. The second variable in our model was, do you live in Nevada? It turns out that Nevadans had a slightly elevated risk of default compared to borrowers in other states. I don't know if that is attributable to Nevada's long association with the gaming industry. Maybe Nevadans are more risk-seeking. Maybe there's something going on macroeconomically in Nevada. But for whatever reason, Nevadans default at higher rates than borrowers in the surrounding states. But Nevada's a really big state. It wasn't do you live in a particular neighborhood in Nevada, which could pose a redlining problem. It's not like we were proposing to avoid a whole community. It's just do you live in Nevada? So also a pretty reasonable variable on which to evaluate a borrower if you're an auto lender. These two variables were both past compliance of this lender. This lender was using these variables to make decisions about whether or not to approve auto loans. There's just one problem. If you're buying a high mileage car in Nevada, there's a 70% probability that you're a person of color. Right? So you think you're making a decision on the basis of state and mileage. You're actually making a decision on the basis of whether this applicant is black, Hispanic, or some other protected status. Right? And so again, this is kind of part of the difficulty with these machine learning systems is that these seemingly fair, seemingly neutral inputs will combine to encode information in ways that no human could possibly discern and lead you to make decisions on the basis of apparent to you. Now, a third challenge that we encountered along our journey. Every algorithm must be given a target, right? An objective that it seeks to relentlessly pursue. And if you think about it, like, for example, in the case of social media, let's say the Facebook algorithm, right? The target of the Facebook algorithm is to keep you, the user, engaged, right? And so the algorithm is going to pursue that objective of keeping you engaged, regardless of whether the stuff it's showing you to keep you engaged is good for your mental health or good for society, right? You didn't tell it to care about those things. You only told the algorithm to care about keeping you engaged. But if you think about it, there are going to be all kinds of unforeseen consequences of giving a robot a single-minded objective to pursue, right? Like, what if we gave the neural networks that power self-driving cars the mere objective of getting passengers from point A to point B? Well, the self-driving car might pursue that objective while blowing through red lights or driving on the sidewalk or causing mayhem to pedestrians, right? So what do we have to do? We have to give the neural networks that power the self-driving cars two objectives, right? Get the passenger from point A to point B while also respecting the rules of the road. And it turns out, with new advances in like adversarial networks, modified loss functions, other Lagrangian techniques, we can give these algorithms multiple objectives. We can do this in financial services too. We can predict who's going to pay back a loan while also minimizing disparities for one group relative to another. And let me give you a sense of what's at stake. This map shows the state of mortgage fairness to women across the country, all the way down to the county level in 2020. If you see green, it means that women are approved for mortgages at a rate of 90% relative to men. If you see yellow, it means that women are approved for mortgages at a rate of between 80 to 90% the rate of men. And if you see red, it means that in that jurisdiction, women are approved at less than 80% relative to men. Do you want to see what the map looks like for black home buyers? That's the right answer. So in many parts of the American mortgage market, black home buyers are approved for mortgages at less than 70% the rate of white home buyers. And so the question we had was, by the way, all of this is the legacy of conventional underwriting techniques, non-machine learning techniques. It's really basically a legacy of using FICO. FICO is the dominant credit score, and when it was invented, it's arguably one of the most important inventions of the 20th century. The problem is FICO can only consume about 20 to 50 variables, and if your data is present and correct, FICO does a pretty good job of assessing your creditworthiness. But the problem is something like 60 million Americans, their data is messy, missing, or wrong, right? And if you've been either excluded from the financial system or preyed upon by the financial system, the likelihood of your data being messy, missing, or wrong is substantially higher. So we asked a simple question, which was, could some of these new algorithmic fairness techniques that come from places like Caltech and Stanford and Carnegie Mellon, could they be better? And here's what we found. This is this is representative of a lender's underwriting model. You can see the accuracy of their model is quite high, 95.63% accurate. So for every 100 loans and decisions, it gets the answer about whether the loan was properly paid back correct 95.63% of the time. Below, you see the fairness outcomes for these various groups, right? You see, like, this algorithm actually treats Hispanic applicants pretty well. It's approving Hispanic applicants at 103% the rate of the control group. It approves Asian Pacific Islanders at 108% of the control group. It approves female borrowers at 92% the rate of men. It approves 62 plus applicants at 117% the rate of folks who are below the age of 62. But that black adverse impact ratio of 75%, we wanted to see if we could get that number higher, right? Could we approve black consumers at higher rates for mortgages? Could we give more black home buyers the American dream in ways that did not compromise the safety and soundness of the lender, and also did not allocate a bunch of defaults, right? Did not put a bunch of black borrowers in debt traps. And here's what we found. First of all, the incumbent algorithm the lender was using to make decisions was heavily relying on credit scores. So these are the variables that were driving this lender's decisions, and approximately 70% of their decisions were driven by credit scores. The remaining 30% of their decisions were made up of these other variables that are commonly found on a credit report, like how many delinquencies do you have, how many inquiries do you have, what are your recurring expenses, and so on. And when we looked at what variables were driving differences in outcomes for Black consumers, we could see that credit score was the biggest driver of disparity for Black consumers. Credit scores represented about 70% of the disparity exhibited by Black consumers. And so we applied a range of algorithmic fairness techniques. We built something like 100 alternative models, of which we identified 7, which were anywhere from 1/3 of a percentage point to 1/2 percentage point more accurate than the lender's incumbent model. And each of those 7 models would have dramatically increased fairness for Black home buyers. In fact, model number 1, which is almost 1/2 percentage point more accurate, would have yielded an additional 5,200 loans for this lender at a rate of accuracy that is higher than what they're used to making today. 5,200 loans, this lender only makes 60,000 loans a year, so an additional 5,200 loans is an increase of 10%, right? So 10% more loans, 16% increase in fairness for Black home buyers at a rate of accuracy that's higher than what the lender is used to today, which means well within this lender's risk tolerance. And when we look at the variables that this second look model or that this fairness optimized model was taking into account, you can see that we've reduced the reliance on FICO from 70% of the predictive power of the model to about 6.5%. So we've reduced the reliance on FICO by about 90%, and we've tuned up the influence of these other variables, which are predictive of risk, but have less of a disparity driving effect for Black consumers. So who are these mythical Black borrowers that we found, right? Well, we found that many of them were just below this lender's cutoff, right? So like if the lender, for example, had a FICO cut of 680, we found a lot of 679s and 678s that performed like 681s and 682s. We found a population of Black home buyers that have exhibited very strong history of repaying their debts, and that have exhibited responsibility when having been awarded bigger credit lines in the past. And when we look at the payback rates, the rates at which the newly approved Black borrowers were paying back relative to their cohort, we see that the newly approved Black borrowers are paying back at 99.91% the rate of the control group. So virtual parity, right? Increase in approval rate, increase in take rates, so because you're now being able to offer people better terms means that they're more likely to accept them, and an increase in fairness. That's good for profits, good for people, I would contend good for progress. This model would have increased profits for this lender by about 12%. Sorry, $12 million, excuse me. So rather substantial amount of additional profit. $130 million of additional credit originated, $12 million of additional profit. So these algorithmic fairness techniques are here, and they are highly performant. One more thing. Cash flow underwriting, which is now considered the state of the art in underwriting. So it used to be that like most underwriting was done on the basis of these credit reports that you pull from the credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, TransUnion. But now companies like Stripe, Plaid, others are allowing lenders to, for lack of a better word, scrape all of your bank account data, which gives these lenders a much finer portrait of the credits and debits into your bank account, and a much more fine-grained and real-time portrait of your ability and willingness to repay a loan. And because that ends up being the truest measure of a consumer's balance sheet, or a truer measure of a consumer's balance sheet than a credit report, you can see that the fairness outcomes from using cash flow underwriting are dramatically better than FICO. Victor Hugo famously said, "There's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come." I submit to you, algorithmic fairness techniques, cash flow underwriting data are ideas whose time has come.